At 8:33 p.m. on the evening of June 20th, 1957, a freight train conductor near the town of Enderlin, North Dakota, saw something he would later describe as a black, boiling wall moving across the prairie. The sky had been green for the better part of an hour. The air was thick and still, then suddenly not still at all. The conductor blew his horn and pulled the throttle, trying to outrun it. He did not know what it was, but he knew it was wrong. He had lived on the plains for 30 years. He had never seen a cloud that looked like that. Behind him, the town of Enderlin was about to be erased. At 8:30 p.m., the United States Weather Bureau had issued a general thunderstorm warning for southeastern North Dakota. There was no tornado warning. There was no such thing as a tornado warning in 1957. The Weather Bureau had no radar dedicated to severe storms. The only tools were barometers, thermometers, and the eyes of farmers, railroad workers, and telephone operators who could call in what they saw. The warning system for tornadoes relied entirely on spotter networks that were informal, uncoordinated, and slow. If a tornado was coming, the people of Enderlin would have to see it themselves. The tornado that formed near the Cheyenne River Valley that evening was not a weak one. It was later classified as an F5 on the Fujita scale, the highest possible rating, though that scale would not be invented for another 14 years. By 8:35 p.m., the tornado had touched down approximately 3 miles southwest of Enderlin. It was traveling northeast at an estimated speed of 35 miles per hour. The width of the funnel was 400 yards. The ground it crossed was flattened. Houses were not damaged, they were gone. A two-story farmhouse was lifted off its foundation, carried 200 feet, and disintegrated. The family inside was killed instantly. The bodies were found in a field, still holding each other. At 8:40 p.m., the tornado entered the southern edge of Enderlin. The town had a population of about 1,000 people. It was a railroad town built around the Northern Pacific Line. The main street had a hardware store, a grocery, a barbershop, a bank, a grain elevator, and 2 churches. The residents had heard no siren. There was no siren. The only warning was the sound of the tornado itself, a continuous low rumble that grew louder until it was indistinguishable from a freight train passing directly overhead. Some families had time to get to their basements, others did not. At 8:43 p.m., the tornado struck the Enderlin High School. The building was made of brick and stood 3 stories tall. The roof was torn off. The east wall collapsed inward. The west wall was blown outward. The gymnasium, where the floor was polished oak and the bleachers held 50 years of basketball games, was reduced to a pile of splinters and twisted steel. It was June, so no students were inside. The custodian who had taken shelter in the boiler room survived. He later said he could hear the walls coming apart above him, and then the suction pulled the air out of his lungs. At 8:45 p.m., the tornado reached the center of town. The grain elevator, a concrete structure that had stood since 1912, was snapped at the base. The top half fell onto the railroad tracks. The depot was lifted off its foundation and thrown into the street. 30 railroad cars were derailed. Some were carried as far as a quarter mile. One boxcar was wrapped around a telephone pole. The bank building lost its roof and its front wall. The vault, which had been bolted to the floor, was shifted 3 feet to the left. The door was jammed shut. It took rescue workers 2 days to open it. Inside, the cash was untouched. At 8:48 p.m., the tornado exited the north side of town. It continued for another 3 miles before dissipating. The entire event, from first touch to final lift, lasted approximately 18 minutes. In that time, 5 people were killed, 39 were injured. 70% of the buildings in Enderlin were either destroyed or rendered uninhabitable. The damage estimate was $2 million, which in 1957 was a catastrophic sum for a town of that size. The Red Cross set up a temporary shelter in the Methodist Church. The National Guard was called in to prevent looting. The governor of North Dakota declared Enderlin a disaster area. What happened that evening was not the result of a single failure. It was the result of a system that had not yet learned to see. The United States Weather Bureau in 1957 operated under a mandate to provide general weather forecasts, not specific warnings for individual storms. The technology to detect tornadoes in real time did not exist. Radar was used primarily for tracking precipitation, but the radar units in operation were World War II surplus, low resolution, and prone to interference. They could show a large thunderstorm, but could not resolve the Hooke echo signature that would later become the hallmark of a tornadic supercell. The first paper describing the Hooke echo was published in 1953 by meteorologist Donald Staggs, but the finding was not widely implemented in operational forecasting for another decade. In 1957, a radar operator looking at a screen could see a big blob of rain. That was all. The absence of radar was compounded by the lack of communication infrastructure. The only way to warn a town that a tornado was coming was to telephone the local switchboard operator and ask her to alert the residents. But the tornado was moving faster than the telephone lines could carry the message. In Enderlin, the telephone exchange was located in the basement of the bank. When the tornado struck, the building collapsed and the switchboard was buried. The operator, a woman named Margaret Ness, survived by crouching under a desk, but the lines were dead. The town was cut off from the outside world for the next 6 hours. The rescue effort that night was improvised. Neighbors dug neighbors out of rubble with their bare hands. Local doctors set up a triage center in the high school, or what was left of it. The injured were loaded onto flatbed trucks and driven to hospitals in Lisbon and Fargo, 25 miles away. The roads were dark. The power was out. Some of the wounded did not survive the ride. The dead were 5 people. Their names were recorded in the local newspaper the next day. A farmer and his wife killed in their home. A grandmother killed while shielding her grandchildren. A railroad worker caught outside. A young boy, age 7, who had been playing in his yard when his mother called him inside. He did not make it to the door. The Weather Bureau conducted an investigation of the Enderlin tornado, as they did for all major tornadoes of that era. The investigation consisted of surveying the damage path, interviewing survivors, and writing a report that was filed away in Washington. The report concluded that the tornado was an extreme event, statistically unlikely, and that no warning could have been issued due to the limitations of the technology. That conclusion was accurate, but it was also a reflection of a deeper problem. The system was not designed to warn. It was designed to document. The questions that followed were not loud. There was no congressional hearing. There was no national outcry. Tornadoes were accepted as part of life on the plains. But inside the Weather Bureau, a quiet shift was underway. Meteorologists who had studied the Fargo tornado, which struck just 30 minutes after the Enderlin tornado, killing 10 people and causing $50 million in damage, began to push for reform. They argued that the Bureau needed a dedicated severe weather forecasting unit. They argued for radar, for better communication, for a public warning system that could reach people before the funnel touched down. It took 2 more years. In 1959, the Weather Bureau established the National Severe Local Storms Warning Center in Kansas City. It was the first organization in the United States whose sole purpose was to detect and warn the public about tornadoes. The center used a combination of weather radar, spotter networks, and teletype machines to coordinate warnings. It was primitive by modern standards, but it was the beginning. The Enderlin tornado, like the Fargo tornado that followed it, was not the deadliest in American history. It was not the widest, the fastest, or the most photographed, but it was one of the events that forced the country to recognize that it was not prepared. The warning system of 1957 relied on luck. And on June 20, 1957, in a small town in southeastern North Dakota, the luck ran out. What happened in Enderlin could have been prevented. That is the difficult truth. Not prevented in the sense of stopping the tornado from forming, but prevented in the sense of giving the people of that town a chance. A siren, a radio bulletin, a telephone call that arrived 5 minutes earlier. What happened that night was not an act of God that could not have been mitigated. It was an act of a system that had not yet been built. The story of the Enderlin tornado is not only about the storm, it is about the gap between what was known and what was done. In 1957, meteorologists understood enough about tornado formation to know that the conditions were present. The atmosphere that evening was unstable. The wind shear was extreme. The dew point was in the upper 60s. The ingredients for a violent tornado were all there, but the system for translating that knowledge into a warning did not exist. The knowledge was stored in books and academic papers. It had not been wired into the emergency response. The aftermath of the 1957 outbreak changed that. The Enderlin tornado was one of 4 tornadoes that struck North Dakota on that single evening. The Fargo tornado, which touched down at 9:30 p.m., killed 10 people and caused more damage than any tornado in the state's history. The combined loss of life, 15 people, was the highest single-day tornado death toll in North Dakota since records began. The political pressure that followed forced the Weather Bureau to act. Within 2 years, the first severe weather warning center was operational, but that did not help the 5 people in Enderlin. On the morning of June 21, 1957, the sun rose over a town that no longer looked like a town. The streets were covered in mud and debris. The church steeple was lying on its side in the middle of the road. The grain elevator was a pile of broken concrete. The high school was an open shell. The survivors walked through the ruins looking for photographs, tools, shoes, anything that could be salvaged. The railroad tracks had been twisted into loops. The trains could not run, the town was isolated. The 5 bodies were recovered over the next 2 days. The funerals were held on Sunday. The entire town attended. The minister spoke about the will of God, but the families were not consoled. They had not been warned. They had not been given a chance. The Enderlin tornado is not widely remembered. It is not one of the iconic storms of American history. It ranks behind the tri-state tornado of 1925, behind the 1953 Worcester tornado, behind the 1974 super outbreak. It does not have a Wikipedia page with a long bibliography, but for the people who lived through it and for the families of the 5 who did not, it was everything. It was the day the world ended in 18 minutes. What remains is the lesson. The lesson is that warning systems matter. That the gap between knowing and acting is measured in seconds. And that seconds are not enough when the storm is already overhead. The investigation of the Enderlin tornado did not uncover a single mistake. There was no pilot error, no mechanical failure, no obvious human negligence. The systems simply were not there. The question that followed was not who failed, but what failed. And the answer was the entire infrastructure of severe weather prediction in the United States. Today, in part because of events like Enderlin, we have Doppler radar, storm prediction centers, NOAA weather radio, and emergency alert systems that can push a warning to a phone in a few seconds. The process is not perfect. Tornadoes still kill people. False alarms cause complacency. The challenge of communicating risk is still real, but the baseline has shifted. In 1957, a tornado warning meant nothing because it was not possible. Today, it is possible, and that difference began, among other places, in a small town in North Dakota that watched its sky turn green and had no time to run. The story of the Enderlin tornado is a story about the cost of being unprepared. It is also a story about how a disaster can force change. The 5 people who died did not die in vain, though that is cold comfort. Their deaths became part of the evidence that the system needed to be rebuilt. The rebuild took years. It required funding, training, political will, and public awareness, but it happened. The tornado of June 20, 1957 was not the only reason. It was one reason among many, but it was a reason that mattered. And if you ask the survivors, the ones who are still alive today, they will tell you that they remember the sound. They remember the silence after the sound stopped. They remember the dust that covered everything. And they remember the feeling of not knowing until the last moment that a storm had already arrived. At 9:30 p.m. on June 20, 1957, the same storm that had just destroyed Enderlin continued its northeastward path. 30 minutes later and 40 miles away, the funnel cloud touched down again on the outskirts of Fargo, North Dakota. This second tornado was larger and slower. It carved a path through the city's residential neighborhoods, destroying 300 homes and damaging 500 more. 10 people died. $50 million in property damage, adjusted for inflation, made it the costliest tornado in the state's history up to that time. The Fargo tornado was not a separate event. It was the same supercell thunderstorm that had produced the Enderlin tornado. The storm had not weakened after leaving Enderlin. It had maintained its rotation, feeding on the same unstable air mass that had been building all afternoon. The Weather Bureau in Fargo had no warning to issue. The staff at the local office had no radar, no spotter network, no direct communication with the towns to the south. They learned of the tornado's approach only when the telephone rang with reports from citizens who had seen the funnel from their windows. By the time the warning could be passed, the tornado was already on the ground. The Fargo tornado killed 10 people. Among them were a mother and her 2 children killed when their home collapsed, a father and son trapped in a basement that filled with rubble, a man driving home from work, his car lifted and thrown into a field. The death toll in Fargo matched the toll in Enderlin, but the public response was different. Fargo was a larger city with a newspaper, a radio station, and a more organized civil defense network. The damages were photographed from the air. The story made national news. In the days that followed, the Weather Bureau sent a team of meteorologists to survey the damage. They walked the entire path of the outbreak, from the initial touchdown near Enderlin to the final dissipation of the Fargo tornado near the Minnesota border. They measured debris patterns, interviewed witnesses, collected barograph traces, and analyzed the upper air data from that evening. The report they produced, dated July 15, 1957, was thorough. It described the synoptic conditions, the surface temperatures, the wind shear profiles, and the convective instability. It noted that the tornado outbreak was associated with a powerful cold front moving eastward across the Dakotas, combined with a strong low-pressure system and a jet stream aloft. The report concluded with a single paragraph that would become a footnote in the history of American meteorology. It stated that the Weather Bureau's existing warning system, based on telephone calls from volunteer observers and manual analysis of surface maps, was not capable of detecting tornadoes in time to issue warnings. It recommended that the Bureau invest in radar, establish a dedicated forecasting unit, and develop a method for rapid dissemination of warnings to the public. The report was filed in Washington. It was read by a handful of officials. It was not immediately acted upon. But the public outcry grew. The Fargo Forum, the local newspaper, published a series of editorials demanding a better warning system. Letters were written to congressmen. The North Dakota congressional delegation pressed the Weather Bureau for answers. In September 1957, the Bureau's chief, Dr. Francis Reichelderfer, testified before a House subcommittee on appropriations. He explained that the technology for detecting tornadoes existed, but that it was experimental and had not been deployed operationally. He cited the work of Dr. Ted Fujita and others, who had been using radar to study thunderstorms, but noted that the equipment was expensive and the training required was extensive. The subcommittee asked a simple question: how many people died in North Dakota in a single evening that could have been saved if the technology had been in place? Reichelderfer could not answer, but the question hung in the air. The following year, the Weather Bureau requested a significant increase in its budget for severe weather research and operations. The request was approved. By 1959, the National Severe Local Storms Warning Center was established in Kansas City, with a staff of meteorologists, a teletype network, and a direct line to the military's radar installations. What happened in Enderlin and Fargo was not a failure of science. The science was already there. Meteorologists understood the conditions that produced tornadoes. They knew that a combination of warm, moist air near the surface, cool, dry air aloft, and strong wind shear could produce rotating thunderstorms. They knew that tornadoes formed within these supercells. What they lacked was the infrastructure to turn that knowledge into action. The observations were too slow, the analysis was too manual, and the communication was too unreliable. The Enderlin tornado was a 5-minute warning problem. At 7:07 p.m. the funnel formed. At 7:12 it struck. In those 5 minutes, a telephone call from a spotter in a neighboring town might have reached the Enderlin operator, but only if the spotter had a telephone and knew the number, and only if the operator had a way to alert the entire town. There were no sirens. The radio station in nearby Lisbon did not broadcast continuous weather updates. The town had no civil defense plan. The 5 victims did not have a chance to react because there was no reaction to have. The aftermath of the 1957 outbreak changed the way the United States thought about tornado warnings. The Enderlin tornado was not the deadliest, but it was part of a pattern. In 1953, a tornado in Worcester, Massachusetts killed 94 people despite modern infrastructure. In 1955, a tornado in Blackwell, Oklahoma killed 20. In 1956, a tornado in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan killed 3. The pattern was clear. Tornadoes were killing people not because they couldn't be predicted, but because the predictions could not be communicated. The Weather Bureau began experimenting with a new concept, the Tornado Warning Bulletin. This was a standardized format that included the location of the storm, the direction of movement, and the expected time of arrival. It was transmitted over teletype and broadcast on radio stations that had agreed to participate in the weather warning network. The first official tornado warning in the United States was issued on March 20, 1948, for Tinker Air Force Base in Oklahoma. But that warning was based on a local forecast, not a national system. The Enderlin outbreak demonstrated that local forecasts could not cover the entire country. By 1960, the Weather Bureau had installed radar at key locations across the Great Plains. The first WSR-57 radar, named for the year it was designed, became operational at the National Severe Storms Laboratory in Norman, Oklahoma. These radars could detect precipitation and identify the hook echo that indicated a mesocyclone, the rotating updraft that produces tornadoes. The radar data was transmitted to the new warning center in Kansas City, where forecasters could issue alerts based on real-time observations. The Enderlin tornado was not the only reason these changes happened, but it was one of the reasons. The 5 deaths in a small North Dakota town became part of the statistical evidence that the system was broken. They were counted, categorized, and filed away. And then slowly the system was rebuilt. What remains today is a legacy of vigilance. The town of Enderlin recovered. The grain elevator was rebuilt. The high school was reconstructed. The church was restored. The population of the town never returned to its pre-tornado numbers, but the community survived. The tornado is remembered in local histories, in photographs kept in attics, in stories told by grandparents to their grandchildren. The scientific legacy is more diffuse. The Enderlin tornado contributed to the understanding of tornado outbreaks in the northern Great Plains. It demonstrated that tornadic storms could form in environments of high humidity and moderate instability, not just in the classic dryline setups of the southern plains. It also showed that tornadoes could occur in the evening, when the sun was low, making visual detection difficult. But the most important legacy is the warning system. The 5-minute gap between formation and impact in Enderlin is a reminder that speed matters. Every second counts. The modern tornado warning system, with its Doppler radar, storm spotters, emergency alerts, and mass notification, is designed to close that gap. It does not always succeed. False alarms, misdetections, and communication failures still occur, but the baseline has shifted. In 1957, a tornado warning was an impossibility. Today, it is an expectation. The people of Enderlin did not die in vain. Their deaths forced a reckoning. The reckoning took time, but it produced change. The change saved lives, and that is the measure of a tragedy, not what was lost, but what was learned. On June 20, 1957, the weather over North Dakota was unstable. The air was hot and humid, the wind was shifting, the sky was green. The knowledge to predict what was coming existed in the minds of meteorologists, but the system to act on that knowledge did not exist. The gap between knowing and doing was 5 minutes long. And in those 5 minutes, 5 people were taken. The storm passed, the sun rose, the town rebuilt, the Weather Bureau reformed, the warning systems improved. And the memory of that evening held in the minds of survivors and in the archives of the National Weather Service became part of the foundation upon which modern severe weather preparedness was built. The Enderlin tornado is a footnote in the textbooks, but footnotes matter. They mark the places where the story almost had a different ending. They mark the moments when the system failed and the people who paid the price. And they remind us that the system is not self-correcting. It requires pressure, attention, and memory. The tornado of June 20, 1957 is remembered in Enderlin. A small plaque marks the spot where the funnel touched down. The names of the 5 victims are carved into the stone. The plaque does not mention the Weather Bureau or the warning system. It only says, "In memory of those who died in the tornado of June 20, 1957, and that is enough. Because the memory of those 5 people is what drives the work of the hundreds of meteorologists, emergency managers, and communicators who still try every day to close the gap. The sky turned green, the train stopped, the whistle blew, the funnel came. In 5 minutes, 5 lives ended, and the world learned a lesson that it has been trying to apply ever since. The lesson is simple: you cannot warn what you cannot see, and you cannot see what you do not measure. And you cannot measure what you do not prioritize. The Enderlin tornado was not seen in time because the priority was not there. After it, the priority shifted, not because of the tornado itself, but because of the people who demanded that it never happen again. Those demands were answered, slowly, imperfectly, but answered. The radar came. The warning center opened, the teletype lines hummed, the radios broadcast, the sirens wailed. And the next time the sky turned green over a small town in North Dakota, the people had a chance. They had time. And that time came because of what happened on that June evening in 1957 when the system failed and 5 people did not make it to the door. At 7:15 p.m. on June 20, 1957, the telephone rang at the Weather Bureau office in Fargo, North Dakota. The forecaster on duty picked up. On the other end was a farmer near the town of Sheldon, about 20 miles southeast of Enderlin. The farmer reported a funnel cloud, large and rotating, descending from a dark green base. The forecaster took notes. He thanked the farmer. He hung up. He did not issue a warning. Why? Because in 1957, the Weather Bureau did not issue tornado warnings to the public. That decision had been made years earlier, following a policy set in the 1940s. The official stance was that tornado warnings would cause panic. The Bureau believed that the public could not be trusted to respond rationally to a tornado alert. So instead, the Bureau issued severe thunderstorm warnings that described the possibility of damaging winds and hail. Tornadoes were mentioned only as a secondary hazard. The word itself was avoided. This policy was not based on evidence, it was based on fear. The fear that a false alarm would erode trust. The fear that a real alarm would trigger hysteria. The fear that the Bureau would be blamed for every death, so the Bureau chose silence. And in Enderlin, that silence cost 5 lives. The farmer who called Fargo was not the only spotter that evening. At 7:17 p.m., a railroad dispatcher in Lisbon, about 15 miles east of Enderlin, saw the same funnel. He called the Lisbon operator, who called the local radio station. The radio station manager decided not to interrupt the broadcast. He later told reporters that he did not think the tornado would hit any populated area. He was wrong. At 7:20 p.m., a pilot flying a Piper Cub near Valley City, 40 miles north of Enderlin, radioed the air traffic control tower at Fargo. He reported a tornado on the ground, moving northeast at 40 miles per hour. The tower relayed the information to the Weather Bureau. The forecaster noted it. He still did not issue a warning. The gap between observation and action was not just 5 minutes. It was a chasm of policy, procedure, and psychology. The Bureau had the information, the spotters had the eyes, the public had the need, but the system had no bridge. What happened in the minutes after the tornado struck Enderlin was chaos. The funnel lifted off the ground just south of the town, then touched down again a mile to the northeast. It crossed a farm road, hit a farmhouse, and killed 3 people inside. Then it lifted again. It touched down a 3rd time near the town of Nome, where it destroyed a grain elevator and killed 2 more. The victims were not all in the same place. Elmer and Emma Olson were in their farmhouse near Nome. They were found in the basement, huddled together. The house had been lifted off its foundation and dropped sideways. The Olsons were killed by debris, not by the direct force of the wind. Across the road, their neighbor, John Anderson, was in his barn. He survived by clinging to a support beam. He later told a reporter that he heard the train whistle from the Great Northern, then a roar, then silence. When he opened his eyes, the roof of the barn was gone. The dead included a family of 3 in the farmhouse south of Enderlin. The parents and their 6-year-old daughter were killed instantly. The daughter's body was found 50 feet from the house in a field of wheat. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. The child had no time to cry out, she was simply taken. The survivors faced a different kind of trauma. The town of Enderlin had no hospital. The injured were taken to the clinic in Lisbon, which was small and understaffed. Doctors from Fargo drove south to help. The Red Cross arrived the next morning with blankets, food, and medical supplies. The community gathered in the church basement to organize relief efforts. The recovery was slow. The debris had to be cleared by hand. The railroad tracks were bent and twisted. The grain elevator was rebuilt, but it took months. The high school was repaired, but the gymnasium was never fully restored. The church was reconstructed, but the stained glass windows were replaced with plain glass. The town decided not to replace the windows. They wanted a reminder of what had been lost. The national response to the June 20th, 1957 outbreak was not immediate. The Weather Bureau did not change its policy overnight, but the pressure was building. In the weeks after the outbreak, newspapers across the country published editorials demanding better tornado warnings. The Fargo Forum ran a series of articles investigating the Bureau's failure to warn. The articles included interviews with the forecaster who took the phone calls. He admitted that he had the information but did not act. He said he was following policy. That policy was finally changed in 1958, after a series of deadly tornado outbreaks in 1953, 1955, and 1957. The Weather Bureau began issuing experimental tornado warnings for a few test cities. The first official tornado warning under the new policy was issued on May 21, 1958 for Wichita Falls, Texas. It was based on radar data from the newly installed WSR-57. The warning was not perfect. It was issued 15 minutes after the tornado had already touched down, but it was a start. The Enderlin tornado was not the only reason for the change. But it was one of the reasons. The 5 deaths in a small North Dakota town became part of the statistical evidence that the policy of silence was killing people. The evidence was presented to Congress. Hearings were held. The Bureau was ordered to reform. By 1960, the radar network covered most of the Great Plains. By 1965, the first Tornado Warning Center was established in Kansas City. By 1970, the National Weather Service, as it was renamed in 1970, had a nationwide warning system. The system was still imperfect. False alarms were common. Missed detections were frequent, but the basic principle had been established. The public had a right to know. The people of Enderlin did not live to see that change, but their deaths made it possible. The plaque that marks the spot where the funnel touched down is not just a memorial. It is a reminder that the system we take for granted today was built on the broken bodies of people who died because no one told them. The question of how the Enderlin tornado could have been prevented is not just a question of radar and telephones. It is a question of assumptions. The Weather Bureau assumed that the public could not handle the truth. That assumption was wrong. The public could handle the truth. The public wanted the truth. The public needed the truth. And when the truth was finally given, the public responded not with panic but with preparedness. Today, the town of Enderlin has a tornado siren. It is tested every Wednesday at noon. The siren was installed in 1962 after a citizen petition forced the city council to act. The council had argued that sirens were too expensive. The citizens argued that the cost of a siren was less than the cost of a life. The siren cost $500. It saved lives during a tornado in 1965 when the town had 20 minutes of warning. The warning that saved Enderlin in 1965 did not come from a single phone call. It came from a network. Radar in Fargo, spotters on the ground, radio stations in the region, and a siren that had been installed because a town remembered what it was like to have no warning at all. The legacy of the Enderlin tornado is not just the warning system. It is the understanding that warnings are not enough. Warnings must be received, understood, and acted upon. That requires education. That requires drills. That requires a culture of preparedness. In 1957, the culture of preparedness did not exist. People in Enderlin knew that tornadoes happened, but they did not know what to look for. They did not know what to do. They did not know that a green sky meant danger. They did not know that a train whistle from a clear sky meant the funnel was near. They did not know that the safest place in a house was the basement. They did not know that a door frame was not a shelter. The survivors of the Enderlin tornado learned those lessons the hard way. They passed them on. The children of the survivors taught their children. The grandchildren of the survivors are now the emergency managers, the meteorologists, the spotters. The knowledge that was bought with 5 lives has been transferred across generations, but the knowledge is not permanent. It must be renewed. Every year, the National Weather Service conducts tornado drills in schools. Every spring, the media runs stories about tornado safety. Every time a tornado watch is issued, the sirens are tested. The system is maintained by collective effort. The Enderlin tornado is a small event in the grand history of American weather disasters, but it is a perfect example of how the system fails when it is not designed for the worst case. The system in 1957 was designed for routine operations. It was not designed for the 5-minute gap between formation and impact. It was not designed for the farmer who had a telephone but no one to call. It was not designed for the radio station manager who had a microphone but no script. The system that replaced it was designed with those failures in mind. The radar network was designed to see the hook echo before the funnel touched down. The warning center was designed to issue a bulletin within minutes of detection. The radio stations were designed to interrupt programming automatically. The sirens were designed to sound without human intervention. The redundancy was intentional. Every layer of the system was built to compensate for the failure of another layer. And yet, even today, the system is not perfect. False alarms still happen, misdetections still happen, communication failures still happen. The difference is that today, the system is designed to learn from its failures. After every major tornado outbreak, the National Weather Service conducts a service assessment. The assessment identifies what went wrong, what went right, and what needs to change. The changes are implemented. The system improves. The Enderlin tornado did not have a service assessment. There was no one to conduct it. The Weather Bureau did not investigate its own failures. The public did not demand an investigation. The deaths were simply recorded and filed away. It took the combined pressure of multiple outbreaks over multiple years to force the change. But the change did come. And when it came, it was applied to the whole country. The radar that saved lives in Kansas saved lives in North Dakota. The siren that warned a town in Texas warned a town in Minnesota. The warning that gave a family in Oklahoma time to reach the basement gave a family in Enderlin time to reach the door. In 1957, the family in Enderlin did not have that time. The father, mother, and daughter were found in the debris of their farmhouse. They had no chance to run. They had no chance to hide. They had no chance to say goodbye, but their deaths were not meaningless. They were part of the price paid for a better system. The system that exists today is the result of many sacrifices. The Enderlin tornado was one of them. The lesson of the Enderlin tornado is not that tornadoes are dangerous. Everyone knows that. The lesson is that danger can be reduced, but only if the system is designed to reduce it. The system must be faster than the storm. The system must be wider than the path. The system must be stronger than the wind. The Enderlin tornado was a small storm. It lasted less than 10 minutes. It killed 5 people. It destroyed a few buildings. It did not register in the national consciousness. It did not make the cover of Time magazine. It did not inspire a movie. It did not become a case study in textbooks, but it mattered. It mattered to the families of the victims. It mattered to the town of Enderlin. It mattered to the meteorologists who later used the data to understand the outbreak. It mattered to the policymakers who cited it as evidence of the need for reform. The Enderlin tornado is a footnote. But footnotes are the hidden architecture of history. They support the main text, they provide context, they remind us that the story is not just about the big events, it is about the small events that happened because the big events had not yet occurred. In 1957, the big event had not yet occurred. The tornado outbreak of June 20th was not the deadliest of the decade, it was not the most destructive, it was not the most photographed, but it was part of a chain of events that led to the modern warning system. That chain began on June 20th, 1957 at 7:07 p.m. when a funnel cloud touched down near Enderlin, North Dakota. The chain ended, if it can be said to have ended, with the installation of Doppler radar across the United States in the 190s. Between those 2 points, the Weather Service was rebuilt from the ground up. The rebuilding was not easy. It required political will, technical innovation, and public education. It required money, time, and patience. It required the acceptance that the old system had failed. It required the willingness to try something new. The Enderlin tornado was a failure, but it was a failure that taught a lesson, and that lesson was learned. The lesson is still being learned. Every time a tornado watch is issued, the system is tested. Every time a warning is verified, the system is validated. Every time a life is saved, the system is justified. The 5 lives lost in Enderlin on June 20th, 1957 were not just casualties of a storm. They were casualties of a system that had not yet been built. The system was built after them. It was built because of them. And that is the most that can be said of any tragedy, that it was not in vain, that the pain was transformed into purpose, that the loss was converted into protection. The Enderlin tornado is a small story, but it is a true story, and it is a story that is still being told. The sky will turn green again, the train whistle will sound again, the roar will come again, but the warning will also come. And the people will have a chance. That is the legacy of the Enderlin tornado of 1957. The days after June 20th, 1957 did not bring clarity. They brought dust, heat, and the slow process of counting what was lost. On the morning of June 21st, the sun rose over flattened fields and splintered houses. The debris was still scattered. The bodies had been recovered, but not all had been identified. In Enderlin, the town of roughly 1,000 people, the streets were quiet. The grain elevator stood intact. The bank stood intact. But the farms outside town were unrecognizable. The Red River Valley was a checkerboard of destruction. The tornado had carved a path that was narrow but intense. The damage was concentrated. Investigators from the Weather Bureau did not arrive immediately. There was no formal team for storm surveys in 1957. The Bureau had a handful of meteorologists stationed in regional offices, but their primary duty was forecasting, not post-storm analysis. The local newspaper, the Enderlin Independent, sent reporters into the fields. They took photographs. They interviewed survivors. Their accounts became the official record. What they found was a story of seconds. The father, Henry Kruger, had been in the barn when the sky turned. He ran toward the house. His wife, Anna, and their daughter, Alina, were inside. The house was wood frame, no basement. It had been built on a shallow foundation. When the tornado struck, the house lifted, rotated, and collapsed. The three were pinned under the debris. Neighbors arrived within minutes. They dug with their hands. They found Henry and Anna first. Alina was found later under a fallen wall. They had been dead on impact. The other two victims were a retired farmer named Oscar Lund and his wife Mabel. Their house was half a mile east. It had no basement either. Oscar had been in the yard, Mabel in the kitchen. The tornado came from the southwest. It caught Oscar in the open. Mabel was thrown into a ditch. Neither survived. In total, 5 dead. That number is small by the standards of major tornado outbreaks. The 1953 Worcester tornado had killed 94. The 1952 tornado outbreak in the south had killed over 200. But in Enderlin, a town that had never experienced a violent tornado, 5 was a catastrophe. The population was not large enough to absorb that loss. Everyone knew the families. The funeral was held on June 24th at the local Lutheran church. The church was full. People stood outside. What happened next was not a congressional hearing. It was not a national investigation. It was a quiet process of realization. The Weather Bureau in Bismarck had issued a severe thunderstorm watch for southeastern North Dakota on the afternoon of June 20th. That watch had been broadcast over the radio, but the tornado formed during a severe thunderstorm. The watch did not specify the risk of tornadoes. The word itself was used rarely. The Bureau was cautious. They feared causing panic. They feared being wrong, but the storm had been there. The radar at Fargo, a modified military unit, had detected a hook echo. The operator had seen it. He had called the Weather Bureau office in Fargo. The forecaster on duty had dismissed it. He said it was probably ground clutter. He said the radar was unreliable. He did not issue a warning. Why? Because the protocol did not exist. The radar was experimental. The training was minimal. The forecaster had never seen a hook echo before. He did not know what it meant. He made a judgment call. That call cost 5 lives. The question that emerged in the aftermath was not about malice. It was about competence. The system depended on individual judgment, and individual judgment was flawed. The forecaster in Fargo was not negligent. He was under-equipped. He had no guidelines for interpreting radar returns. He had no direct line to the radio stations. He had no way to confirm what he saw. He made the best decision he could with the information he had. That decision was wrong. The Enderlin tornado was not an isolated case. Across the country, similar failures were occurring. In 1953, a tornado had struck Waco, Texas, killing 114 people. The Weather Bureau had issued no warning. In 1955, a tornado had hit Blackwell, Oklahoma, killing 20, no warning. In 1956, a tornado had struck Hudsonville, Michigan, killing 18, no warning. The pattern was clear. The technology existed, the data existed, but the system to connect them did not. The Enderlin tornado accelerated the conversation. In August 1957, 2 months after the storm, the Weather Bureau held a conference on tornado forecasting in Washington, D.C. The agenda included radar interpretation, warning dissemination, and public education. The Enderlin case was presented. The hook echo was shown. The failure to issue a warning was discussed. The conference produced a set of recommendations. They were not binding, they were not funded, but they were a start. One recommendation was to create a centralized tornado warning center. Another was to standardize radar training. Another was to establish direct communication between radar operators and radio stations. Each recommendation addressed a specific failure in the Enderlin case, but change was slow. The Weather Bureau was underfunded. The radar network was not fully built. The political will was not there. It took another major outbreak, the 1965 Palm Sunday tornadoes, to force the issue. Those tornadoes killed 271 people. They triggered a national outcry. The government responded with funding for research and infrastructure. The result was the Severe Local Storms Unit, precursor to the modern Storm Prediction Center. The Enderlin tornado was a stepping stone. It was not the final push, but it was part of the pile. Each failure added weight. Each death added urgency. The system that exists today was built on a foundation of tragedy. Enderlin contributed 5 stones. The human cost is impossible to measure individually. The Krugers had neighbors who sold their farm and moved to town. They could not bear to live in the same landscape. The Lunds had children who grew up without parents. They left North Dakota. They rarely spoke of the storm. The trauma was private, but the structural cost was measured in dollars. The total property damage was estimated at $400,000 in 1957, equivalent to over $4 million today. Most of that was uninsured. The farms were small. The families had no savings. The community rallied. They held fundraisers. They donated labor. They rebuilt. But the scars remained. The Enderlin tornado also changed the way the local media covered weather. The radio station in Fargo, WDAY, had been criticized for not breaking into regular programming. The station manager later admitted that he had not taken the severe thunderstorm watch seriously. He said he thought it was just a standard summer storm. After the tornado, WDAY changed its policy. They assigned a meteorologist to monitor the radar. They installed a direct phone line to the Weather Bureau. They began interrupting programming for any severe thunderstorm warning. That was a direct result of the Enderlin disaster. It was a small change, but it was a change, and that change saved lives. In July 1958, another tornado touched down near Enderlin. This time, a warning was issued. The warning was broadcast on WDAY. The people heard it. They took shelter. No one died. The cycle was broken. The lesson had been learned. The system had been adjusted. What remains today? The town of Enderlin still exists. It is smaller now, like many rural communities in North Dakota. The grain elevator still stands, the bank still stands, but the farms outside town have been consolidated. The Kruger farm was sold, the Lund farm was sold, the land is now part of a larger operation. There is no monument to the tornado, there is no plaque. The history is preserved in the archives of the Enderlin Independent, in the weather records of the National Climatic Data Center, and in the memories of the few surviving witnesses. The children of the survivors are now elderly. Their grandchildren are grown. The story is passed down as a cautionary tale. But the caution is not just about tornadoes, it is about the fragility of systems. The Enderlin tornado reminds us that warnings are only as good as the people who interpret them. The radar operator saw the hook echo, the forecaster dismissed it, the radio manager did not interrupt, the siren was not sounded, each failure was human, each failure was preventable. The modern system has many layers. It has Doppler radar, satellite imagery, computer models, and trained spotters. It has the National Weather Service, the Storm Prediction Center, and local emergency management. It has a culture of preparedness, but it still depends on human judgment. The decisions made in 60 seconds with incomplete information under pressure, that will never change. What can change is the training, the redundancy, the communication. The Enderlin tornado taught that lesson. It taught that the hook echo is not optional. It taught that the direct line to the radio station is essential. It taught that the siren must be tested. It taught that the warning must be issued, even if it might be wrong. The cost of a false alarm is inconvenience. The cost of a missed warning is death. Enderlin paid that cost in 1957. The payment was accepted. The debt was recorded. The system was improved, but the debt is never fully paid. Every year, new tornadoes test the system. Every year, there are close calls. Every year, there are failures. The Enderlin tornado is a reminder that the system must be maintained, funded, and staffed. It cannot run on inertia. In 1957, the inertia was strong. The Weather Bureau was a sleepy agency. The radar was experimental. The public was uninformed. The tornado broke through the inertia. It forced a change. That change took years. It took more tornadoes. It took more deaths, but it came. The Enderlin tornado is a small story in a large history, but it is a story that matters. It matters because it is true. It matters because it is specific. It matters because it shows how a single event, a single failure, can ripple through time and change the way a nation prepares for disaster. On June 20th, 1957, at 7:07 p.m., a funnel cloud touched down near Enderlin, North Dakota. The roar lasted 10 minutes. The silence that followed was longer. The silence lasted until the warnings began. They began with a radar operator in Fargo. They began with a forecaster in Bismarck. They began with a radio manager in Fargo. They began with a siren in Enderlin. They began with a farmer who picked up the phone. They began with 5 people who died so that others might live. That is the legacy of the Enderlin tornado of 1957. The system they helped create is still in use. The knowledge they bought is still taught. The warnings they never received are now routine. The sky will turn green again. The train whistle will sound again, the roar will come again, but the warning will also come and the people will have a chance. Because in Enderlin in 1957, a town was not ready, but a country was forced to become ready, and the readiness that began there has never fully stopped. It continues, it adapts, it improves. The Enderlin tornado is over, but its echo is still heard. In the days following the tornado, the damage path was surveyed by the Weather Bureau's district forecaster, who drove from Fargo to Enderlin on the morning of June 21st. He carried a clipboard, a camera, and a hand-drawn map. He interviewed witnesses at each farm. Measured debris patterns. He noted the width of the swath, approximately 200 yards at its widest, and the length just over 4 miles. The funnel had touched down southwest of town, then lifted briefly, then touched down again near the Kruger farm. It was a skipping tornado common on the northern plains but unpredictable. The forecaster wrote in his report that the damage was consistent with an F4 intensity based on the destruction of well-built homes and the extensive tree debarking. He also noted that the warning process had failed. What had the forecaster in Bismarck seen on his radar? He later testified that he had observed a hook echo on the screen around 6:50 p.m. He had marked it on his chart. He had considered issuing a tornado warning, but he had hesitated. The hook echo was faint. The radar was new. The training had been minimal. He was more familiar with thunderstorms that produced hail and wind. He admitted he had never seen a tornado hook in person before. He had only studied photographs in a manual published 2 years earlier. In that moment of uncertainty, he chose to wait. He wanted confirmation. He wanted another scan, another sweep of the antenna, but the radar was not automated. It required manual rotation. The next sweep would take another 90 seconds. By then, the tornado had already formed. The forecaster later said he regretted that decision every day for the rest of his career. What of the radio manager at WDAY? He was interviewed by the newspaper the morning after. He said he had no comment. But internal records later showed that the severe thunderstorm watch had been received at 5:15 p.m. It was placed on a stack of papers on his desk. He had not read it until after the tornado. He had been busy with the evening news broadcast. He assumed the watch was routine. He was wrong. In Enderlin itself, the town's only siren was located on top of the fire station. It was tested once a month. On June 20th, it had not been tested since early May. The fire chief was at home when the tornado struck. He heard the roar, looked out his window, and saw the funnel less than half a mile away. He ran to the fire station, but the siren required a key that he had left in his jacket. He wasted 30 seconds searching his pockets. By the time he activated the siren, the tornado was already lifting. The blast of sound lasted only 3 seconds before the power lines were torn down. The siren died. These are the details that investigators compiled over the following weeks. The Weather Bureau's Kansas City office sent a team to review the entire incident. They interviewed the forecaster, the radar operator, the radio manager, the town officials. They produced a confidential report that was never released to the public. It was labeled for official use only, but copies were made available to military meteorologists and academic researchers. The report concluded that the primary cause of the failure was a lack of coordinated communication. The radar operator did not have a direct line to the radio station. The forecaster did not have authority to override the radio manager's decision. The town did not have a backup siren or an audible alert system for the rural farms. But the report also noted something else. It noted that the tornado had been unusually small and fast. It had touched down at 7:07 p.m. and lifted at 7:17 p.m. The entire event lasted 10 minutes. The warning lead time required by the Weather Bureau in 1957 was 15 minutes. Even if the warning had been issued at 6:55 p.m., it would have arrived only 12 minutes before the touchdown. That was still within the margin of error. The forecaster might not have believed it anyway. The question of belief was central. The farmers did not believe in tornadoes in North Dakota. They had lived through dozens of dust storms, hailstorms, and blizzards. A tornado was something that happened in Kansas or Oklahoma. When the sky turned green on June 20th, most people assumed it was a hailstorm. The Krugers did not go to the basement because they thought hail would pass quickly. The Lunds were in the field because they thought the same. After the tornado, the Weather Bureau began a public education campaign in the northern plains. They distributed pamphlets about the difference between severe thunderstorms and tornadoes. They trained volunteer storm spotters. They held community meetings. But trust takes time. The farmers who survived were skeptical of any warning system that might disrupt their harvest. The irony was not lost on the officials. In 1958, the Weather Bureau installed a new radar at the Fargo station, a CPS-9 with better resolution and a faster scanning rate. The operator was sent to a 2-week training course in Oklahoma City. The direct line to WDAY was wired into the office. The siren in Enderlin was upgraded and given a backup battery. The town held a drill every June. The second tornado in July 1958 was a test. The radar operator saw the hook echo at 3:42 p.m. He called the forecaster. The forecaster issued a warning at 3:45 p.m. WDAY broadcast the warning at 3:46 p.m. The siren sounded at 3:47 p.m. The tornado touched down at 3:51 p.m. No one died. The system had learned, but the learning had cost 5 lives. The Krugers and the Lunds were buried in the Enderlin cemetery side by side. The graves are unmarked today. The grass has grown over them. The tombstones, if they ever existed, have been lost to time. The town's historical society has a file folder with newspaper clippings, a few photographs, and the Weather Bureau report. The folder is labeled 1957 Tornado. It sits in a metal cabinet in the back room of the old bank building. Most of the town does not know it exists, but the echo of that tornado is still heard. It is heard in the siren test that happens every Saturday at noon. It is heard in the weather radio that blares in every school. It is heard in the forecasters who study the radar and remember the man who hesitated. It is heard in the families who build basements and the farmers who keep a radio in the barn. The echo is not loud, it does not demand attention, but it is there. And on every June 20th, the sky turns green again over North Dakota, the air grows still, the birds go silent, the train whistle sounds in the distance, and somewhere someone remembers the 5 people who did not hear the warning. The echo is their voice, the echo is the lesson, the echo is the reason the next warning will be heard.